Many of you know that my uncle died recently, very suddenly and unexpectedly. And our family gathered for the funeral service, and then we did what so many do after a funeral. We had a meal together. It gave us a chance to take a breath. And while we gathered and ate, we told stories about Uncle Ralph. His brothers shared stories about what he was like as a kid, and we remembered all the things about him that we loved, and we gave thanks to God for those memories. I learned things that day, and I was reminded of things that day about my family, about where we came from and who we are. Some of my strongest memories of my uncle involve Thanksgiving, because we always have Thanksgiving in my aunt and uncle's house. And he always carved the turkey. And he and my brother would always banter back and forth, making everyone laugh. Ralph loved the pie after the meal. That was the one thing that could get him away from watching the football game. And as I talk about this, just even in these briefest of sketches, I can almost smell and taste the food of Thanksgiving. I can almost hear his voice. There's something really powerful about the food that we eat and the stories that we tell, and the ways that they're intertwined with memory and ritual that form and shape us as individuals and as a community. They tell us something about where we came from and who we are. So if you want to know who you are, eat a meal and tell a story. And then do it again. And that's been true since our earliest days as human beings. Long before stories were written down in books, communities gathered around campfires at night and listened to the stories that defined them as a people. And the stories contained in this book began as stories that were told from generation to generation. And these stories continue to shape our identity as children of God. They tell us who we are. Now, this morning we heard two stories, and they were both stories about meals. The first was about the institution of the Passover. Now, it's interesting because, the first 15 or so chapters of Exodus are really quite action-packed. But we don't really get that impression from the two chapters that we read from this morning, right? On one side of this story is the battle that God is in with the Pharaoh of Egypt to rescue Egypt from slavery. And God has appointed Moses and Aaron to announce, and in some cases even enact, these grisly plagues. And there's this tension building as to what is going to happen. 9 times something bad happens, and we think, okay, Pharaoh is going to set God's people free, and then he doesn't. And then the 10th plague is announced, and it's a really bad one, and we want to know what's going to happen. And instead, we get all this stuff for procuring a lamb without blemish and how to cook it and what side dishes to serve. Now, don't worry, the story will eventually take us back to that nail-biting tension as Israel finds themselves trapped between Egypt's army and the Red Sea. But in between all that drama, we get these 2 chapters narrating the Passover. And 80% of that Passover story is basically minute instructions for how to prepare and eat their dinner. And now, we're going to see how much working with my esteemed colleague here has rubbed off on me, because I am about to compare the Passover to Star Wars. I didn't think I'd do this, but we're just going to say it's in honor of James Earl Jones, and I'm going to go there. So, Okay, this section of the text in Exodus is sort of like you're watching Star Wars and you get to that climactic scene in The Empire Strikes Back, where Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker are having their lightsaber duel. And remember that part where Vader has just disarmed Luke, and then he reveals that he's Luke's father. And Luke is like, no! That scene, right? Okay. So I read someone who said, imagine if that scene went more like this. Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me enough. He told me you killed him. No, You know what else Obi-Wan never told you about? My savory meatloaf recipe. First, you need a pound of ground beef, grass-fed Angus, and steel-cut oats. It has to be steel-cut oats. Luke, are you writing this down? Okay, that would be crazy, right? But that's pretty much what's happening here in Exodus. The tension is rising. We don't know whether the people are going to be saved. And Moses stops and tells the people what kind of lamb to eat, how to cook the lamb, how to bake the bread, how to divide the lamb among households, what side dishes to serve, what pace the meal is to be eaten at, what to wear to dinner, what you're supposed to talk about at dinner, and what to do with the lamb's blood. I'll admit that for a long time when reading Exodus, I just sort of skimmed over this part, because I wanted to get back to the action. And I didn't think that these dinner instructions had much to do with me or Jesus or the life of the church. But the thing is, the Passover has everything to do with Jesus and you and me and God's people. Think again about Star Wars. Luke didn't realize it at the time, but Vader actually gave him a gift when he said, I am your father. Because now Luke knows a little more about the story of who he is and where he came from. God also gave the Passover to Israel as a gift so that they may know more. They may remember who they are and where they came from. And the Passover also helps us know who we are and where we came from. Because if you want to know who you are, eat a meal and tell a story. And the Passover meal tells a powerful story about God's faithfulness to God's people. It invites us to slow down from the action of our lives and take a breath and remember who we are. So let's look at a few of these details, because this isn't just any old meatloaf recipe. You can follow along if you want in Exodus chapter 12 in your Bible or the Pew Bible, or if you have a Bible app. So verse 2, chapter 12. It says, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." So the celebration of Passover marks the beginning of months for the community. In other words, this event reorients the community's understanding of time. Now, we've all got important moments and events and seasons in our lives that serve as time markers, right? Days when our lives changed significantly. Whether that's the day you met your partner, the birth of a child, or the death of someone close, or any host of events where we can look back and say, my life changed that day. But when those things happen, we don't typically say, okay, we're going to start counting time all over again. This date that life changed is now going to be the first day of the year in a new calendar that we're starting right now. Happy New Year. It's January 1st. Yet that's exactly what God tells Moses would be true for Israel. At the beginning of chapter 12, God tells Moses to create a brand new calendar with that day and that month being the equivalent of January 1. Time resets. They're not to live in Egypt time anymore. They are now living in God's time. God is doing an act of new creation. In some way, God sees what is happening to Israel as remaking the world. history is going to start over right here and right now. And that's why the events themselves are so full of instructions on how best to remember the events forever. So verse 3, tell the whole congregation of Israel they are to take a lamb for each household. And if a family is too small for a whole lamb, then they need to get together with another family. So everyone will have some, and no one will have too much. God is forming a community here where everyone has enough. Verse 6, the lamb's slaughter takes place at twilight. It's literally translated between the evenings. It's this hour of transition between day and night, a time of ending and beginning. And the lamb's blood on the doorposts of the Israelites' houses also marks transition. The doorway, the site of entry and exit, is marked with the lifeblood of the lamb, protecting, hallowing, and preparing their departure from slavery. Now, the blood itself wasn't some magic talisman. It was a sign for God, yes, who will see the blood and pass over each Israelite house. But look at verse 13. God says it will be a sign for you. At the end of the day, God probably doesn't need a sign. God knows who has been faithful. But God knows we need visual and tangible things that remind us of God's promises to protect us and free us from the sin that enslaves us. The meal itself is also symbolic. Verse 8, they'll eat bitter herbs, a sensory reminder of the suffering endured. The flat bread made without yeast is a bread of haste and readiness. The instructions for cooking the lamb are specific, neither raw nor boiled. Now, raw makes sense, why they wouldn't do that, but why not boiled? Well, one interpretation of that is that the waters of Egypt have been a source of death for the Israelites, and so the Israelites will leave them behind. Instead, they shall cook their meal in the fire, as a reminder of the fire of God's presence in the burning bush, and a foreshadowing of the fire that will lead them through the wilderness to new life. So that's a lot more than a meatloaf recipe, right? Time is reordered. Everyone is included. A community is formed. And most of all, God's saving power to lead people out of slavery and death into freedom and new life is seen and tasted and experienced. Everything in this meal has meaning. These descriptions that seem at first like an intrusion into the story actually is the heart of the story. If you want to know who you are, eat a meal and tell a story, and then do it again. And do this so you can remember. This is a day of remembrance, God commands. But it's not an ordinary way of thinking back. It's a special kind of memory. When hundreds and thousands of years later, the people gather and have this meal, they're not just to recall the Exodus from Egypt, but remember it as though they had been there. To this day, when observing the Passover, Jewish folks don't say, we remember this night how God led those people long ago out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. Instead, the memory hooks them into the divine narrative by saying, we remember this night how God led us out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. By this act of remembrance, we become something we would not otherwise be. We become that people. That story becomes our story. So what does this have to do with Jesus? Well, You may have noticed a number of similarities between the Passover and the Last Supper. Things like deliverance from bondage and death, and association with the death of the firstborn son, the lamb that was sacrificed, the theme of darkness and night, the blood that protects from death, the wine of the Passover meal, the unleavened bread. And then there's the simple fact that Jesus' Last Supper with the disciples was a Passover meal. So all of that meaning and symbolism and remembering about God's freedom and salvation are all brought forward into the celebration of communion that we share. Indeed, in our celebration around this table, the past comes into the present. Everyone is included. A community is formed. God's saving power to lead people out of slavery and death and into freedom and new life is seen and tasted and experienced. And as we gather around the table today, we remember what happened in the past, but we enact it here in the present. God really is present here and now through our meal and our story. And we really are God's people. So if you want to know who you are, eat a meal, tell a story, and then do it again. May our stories and our rituals, our gatherings and our meals never cease to point to God's faithfulness and salvation and promise of new life. May we today enter into this ancient story and taste and see the goodness of God. Amen.